Welcome everybody, bienvenue tout le monde à notre webinaire sur l'OTAN, NORAD et les armes nucléaires. Je m'appelle Kim Montgomery, je suis la présidente de la section montréalaise de World Beyond War. Je serai l'animatrice avec Rachel Small, qui est l'organisatrice pour Canada de World Beyond War. Le sujet, c'est les armes nucléaires, l'OTAN et le NORAD. Ça serait une séance d'1h30. Et now I'll switch to English if you'll forgive me, but we will have, on va avoir une séance de questionnement à la fin dans tous les deux langues. The question period at the end will be in both languages. So welcome everybody to our webinar, NATO, NORAD and Nuclear Arms. My name is Kim Montgomery. I'm the chair of World Beyond War Montreal, a new chapter. And I will be moderating along with Rachel Small, who's the Canadian organizer of World Beyond War. Hi, Rachel. She's also being our timekeeper, and we'll chair the question and answer period. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Although this is a virtual event, I invite everyone present to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we occupy as settlers. I'm speaking to you from Montreal, which is known as Tiautiake, and it's situated within the traditional unceded lands of the Ganakeyake, the Mohawks, who are people who are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So we thank the traditional custodians of this land and promise to continue the work of reconciliation. A little bit about the Zoom environment. I just wanted to say, I recommend that you put at the top right your view, that you use speaker view so that you can focus on the speaker, but of course it's entirely up to you if you prefer the gallery, don't be shy. As Rachel said, please stay muted because there can be sound interference if you keep your mic on. And then you can turn your video on or off as you please, but for the question and answer, I suggest that you put it on so that people can see each other as we discuss together. I hope you all know how to use the chat. You click the little chat icon at the bottom and you can enter your comments, your text, or say hello, whatever. And some people don't know how to raise your hand. So when we get to the question period, if you want to raise your hand, just click the reactions button at the bottom on the right there, and you can click raise hand. And that's how you raise and lower your hand when we get to the question period. Where's Yves? Oh, there he is. So welcome, Yves. Yves is our speaker today. He's a Montreal-based activist, author, and foreign policy expert. He's a member of World Beyond War's advisory board. His most recent book, Stand on Guard for Whom, tackles Canadians' military history and culture, and it's featured in World Beyond War's book club in March 2022, if you want to sign up for that. I have here a quote I like from Matthew Behrens, who wrote in Quill and Choir about Yves, said, "Yves Engler is part of that rare but growing group of social critics, unafraid to confront Canada's self-satisfied myths, regardless of whose feathers he ruffles in the process." So welcome, Yves. I'll turn it over to you. Or I'm sorry, Rachel, did you have anything to add?
No, that's it. Just maybe a reminder to everyone to write down any questions that you have, keep them in mind, and we will save them for the end. And if you're someone who's not going to be able to speak up or raise your hand to ask your question, you'll also be welcome to type it in the chat. We'll look out for that.
Over to you, Yves.
Thank you. Thanks a lot to World Beyond War and World Beyond War Montreal for organizing this. It's really important that we kindle anti-war activism here, well, across the country, but also here in Montreal. So I really I salute the work that Rachel's been doing over the past couple of years, getting World Beyond War going in Canada, and also Kim here in Montreal. So I was asked to talk about NATO, NORAD, and nuclear weapons, and so that's what I'm gonna do. I think the first thing when looking at these issues and Canada's relationship to militarism, I guess in general, is to understand the historical context, the somewhat unique, I think, historical context of the Canadian military, which is that the Canadian military is an outgrowth of the British forces that conquered Turtle Island, that did it often, quite violently. And it was a force that went from conquering Turtle Island on behalf of London to being part of British imperialism all around the world, from West Africa to Afghanistan. Here I'm talking about late 1800s, early 1900s, to South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. Canada's military went from a part of the British Empire to being a close part of the American Empire quite fluidly. So when we're looking at these NATO, NORAD, and nuclear weapons, I think that's the sort of broad context that we have to understand about the Canadian military, Canadian society more generally, but the Canadian military is probably one of the clearest examples of institution that's been sort of integral to the two main empires of the past 200 plus years. In the case of NATO, it was very concretely an initiative of the Anglosphere, or more specifically, the US, Britain, and Canada. And Canadian officials, British officials, American officials organized the initial secret meetings to establish NATO in 1948. Some people say that it was actually a Canadian idea, and this was Canada sort of really tightening the ties between the two main empires, Washington and London. NATO has been incredibly important to Canadian foreign policy, Canadian defense policy, military so-called defense policy. So you have Lester Pearson in 1963 saying, NATO has been the foundation of the foreign policy of Canadian governments ever since it was formed in 1949, and it will continue to be so. You have Pierre Trudeau in 1969, newly elected prime minister. NATO in reality had determined all of our defense policy. We had no defense policy, so to speak, except that of NATO. And our defense policy had determined all of our foreign policy. And we had no foreign policy of any importance except that which flowed from NATO. Jack Granatstein, prominent military historian in 2007, saying, quote, NATO is the alliance to which Canada had devoted perhaps 90% of its military effort since 1949, and things haven't really changed. Even if you look at the Suez crisis and Canada's role in the creation of peacekeeping, the actual motivation of that, and I'm not going to get into detail, we can, in the question period, the motivation of that was to paper over a division between London and Washington, paper over a division within NATO. And that was really the motivation for the 1956 UN peacekeeping force that Canada sent. So what was NATO's initial motivation? NATO's initial motivation was really twofold. One was to block the left, the socialist, communist left in Western Europe from winning elections and winning office. They were very popular after World War II. And so we stationed tens of thousands of troops in Western Europe, in large part to stop the left-wing wave that was taking hold in Western Europe. And in fact, Lester Pearson, then Canadian foreign minister in 1949, was pretty open about this in the House of Commons. He said, quote, "The power of the communists, wherever that power flourishes, depends upon their ability to suppress and destroy the free institutions that stand against them. They pick them off one by one: the political parties, the trade unions, the churches, the schools, the universities, the trade associations, even the sporting clubs and the kindergartens." The communists are coming for the kindergartens. "The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is meant to be a declaration to the world that this kind of conquest from within will not in the future take place among us," right? So the communists in France were coming for the kindergartens, and we need to send troops to block this conquest from within. So that was part of the motivation to establish NATO. The other part of the motivation to establish NATO was to bring the former colonies, which were greatly weakened after World War II, and there was a rise of decolonization movements around the world, to bring the former European colonial powers under the US-led geopolitical umbrella, and to stunt decolonization, and to bring that decolonization, to the extent it was happening, under basically shift from formal European colonialism to American imperialism. Pearson was pretty open about the view that NATO was designed to maintain Anglosphere or US or British, what do you want to call it exactly, power all around the world, right? So it was, this idea of it's about defending Western Europe from the aggressive Soviets, which Canadian officials understood completely, that the Soviet Union was totally destroyed during World War II, 20 million people dead. They were not in a position to, conquer Paris or London. So they understood that internally. But so Pearson said just before the creation of NATO, there is no better way of ensuring the security of the Pacific Ocean at this particular moment than by working out between the great democratic powers a security arrangement, the effects which will be felt all over the world, including the Pacific area. Then a couple of years later, he said that the Middle East was vital to European and North Atlantic area defense. Then in 1953, he said, there is now only a relatively small geographical gap, what was in fact 5,000 kilometers, between Southeast Asia and the area covered by the North Atlantic Treaty, which goes to the eastern boundaries of Turkey. So basically, Pearson understood NATO as US-led domination of the entire world. And when we sent troops to Korea in 1950, in a US-led war, Pearson and some American officials justified sending troops to Korea in the context of NATO, and that what was happening in Korea was a threat to the North Atlantic area. Now, concretely, in the 1950s, Canada provided $1.5 billion in NATO mutual assistance aid to the European colonial powers. About $8 billion today, ammunition, guns, fighter pilots or fighter jets or different aviation equipment, jets. And they did that while the colonial powers were suppressing independence movement in Algeria, most famously while the French had 400,000 people in Algeria suppressing the independence there. Canada was providing bullets to the French when they knew that French troops were using those bullets to kill anti-colonial activists. Same thing with the British in Kenya with the Kikuyu, the so-called Mau Mau revolt. The Congolese, the Belgians in the Congo, etc. Through the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, NATO played an important part in shaping Canada's relationship to decolonization in Africa. In 1964, in fact, the Nigerian Labour Party published a pamphlet called The NATO Conspiracy in Africa, that talked about how NATO's role across the continent, and it was viewed as stunting the anti-colonial movement. Now, with the end of the Cold War, it didn't stop NATO as a aggressive force. The whole idea again is this defensive posture towards the Soviets, but that which was never true becomes completely untenable after the Warsaw Pact ends and the Soviet Union collapses. And yet what you see, in fact, is that NATO becomes even more belligerent, right? So you have the 1999 bombing of the former Yugoslavia, where Canadian fighter jets were part for 78 days of bombing. Then you have 40,000 Canadian troops, the NATO mission to Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014. Then you have Libya, where a Canadian general led the bombing of Libya in 2011, despite the very clear objections of the African Union. So you have basically a alliance, which again, it's supposed to be this defensive arrangement that will come to each other's defense if one nation is attacked, but in fact is a tool of primarily US-led domination around the world. Today, we're hearing a lot about what's going on with regards to Eastern Europe and NATO expansion, further onto Russia's doorstep. Yesterday, the day before, the Financial Times had a quote from Ross Gottemoeller, who's a former NATO Deputy Secretary General, and he was talking about this Russia saying that we're not accepting any more NATO expansion eastward. Right, that was the promise, of course, that was given to Gorbachev in 1990, 1991 around the withdrawal of Russian troops from Germany, and was that they wouldn't go one inch eastward. Right, Germany would be allowed to be unified and be part of NATO, but NATO wouldn't expand eastward. Well, in fact, over the past 30 years, NATO has expanded far eastward, and Canadian government has been a big advocate of that, which of course Moscow views as very threatening. And now we have a situation where there's NATO, not only are NATO countries border Russia, countries bordering Russia part of NATO, you have NATO troops, Canadian, American, British troops stationed basically permanently now, in the case of Canadian troops in Latvia, or semi-permanently, right on Russia's doorstep, right on its border, and Russia, I think, totally understandably. I mean, Russia got destroyed in two different wars in the 1900s, so the Russian position is saying, no more NATO expansion, primarily with regards to the Ukraine. And the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO is quoted in the Financial Times saying, quote, "NATO is not going to change its policy on enlargement, period. It is part of NATO's DNA," right? It's part of its DNA is to just steadily ramp up tension, expansionism. That's what the former NATO Deputy Secretary General is saying, and he's not saying it in a critical perspective. He's saying it from a sympathetic perspective. And so today you have a situation where there's Canadian troops, like I said, about 500 Canadian troops leading a NATO mission in Latvia. There's Canadian fighter jets in Romania. There's obviously Canadian troops in the Ukraine, not formerly part of a NATO mission, but there's Canadian troops in the Ukraine. There's Canadian naval vessels that patrolling in the region. And from the perspective of Moscow, this is aggressive. This is ramping up tensions, but NATO doesn't of course care. NATO every day, not when there's a new war, but every day, NATO vessels, maritime missions are basically all around the world, right? You have in the North Sea, in the Mediterranean, circumnavigating Africa. Most recently, you have NATO in October, I believe, at a recent summit, basically citing China now. So now NATO, again, this is supposed to be about defensive arrangement of the North Atlantic region, and now it's pivoting towards China. And so it really is a organization about U.S. dominance of the region. Concretely within Canadian politics, it obviously prods Canada to join these aggressive belligerent missions, but it also pushes increased military spending, right? We're told that we have to spend 2% of our GDP on military spending, just because 15 years ago, NATO ministers got together and decided that was this arbitrary number was what needed to be spent. Also, of course, it leads to Canada purchasing weaponry that's more interoperable with U.S. Weaponry, and it's very good for the U.S. Military industrial complex on that level, in that it pushes countries to purchase U.S. weaponry, which of course is good for the profit margin of the American arms firms. NATO, of course, is a nuclear alliance. There's NATO nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons in a number of European countries. Canada participates in the NATO Nuclear Planning Group. It funds and supports NATO's Nuclear Policy Directorate. This goes back to the mid-1950s, where Canada voted to allow NATO forces to accept tactical nuclear weapons. NATO has been a justification for the Canadian government to vote against all kinds of different measures to denuclearize. You find example after example of Canadian officials justifying different nuclear policies because of NATO. So, for instance, in 1983, Pierre Trudeau, who was supposedly trying to rid the world of nuclear weapons, he justified having nuclear-tipped cruise missile testing in Canada. He said, quote, "Having declared our support for the two-track strategy, Canada should bear its fair share of the burden which that policy imposes on the NATO alliance." So because we're part of NATO and NATO includes using nuclear weapons as part of its policy, we should be allowing for that testing within Canada. In 2017, the NDP Foreign Affairs critic Hélène Lavadière criticized the Trudeau government, saying it hid behind Canada's NATO membership in opposing efforts to organize UN meeting on planning for the abolition of nuclear weapons, what ultimately became the UN nuclear ban treaty. And the question of nuclear weapons is a very serious question, right? This is a serious threat to humanity by anything from a mistake to policies that are pursued that tension escalates, and the people in Washington and maybe in Moscow didn't want to go to didn't want to be using nuclear weapons, but things escalate to the point where that it gets to that stage. And the nuclear weapons that exist, the more powerful ones, are 80 times more deadly than what was dropped on Japan 75 years ago, right? The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists set their doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight. I guess it's about 2 years ago now, right? Of course, Donald Trump withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and of course the Iran nuclear deal. So it's a real threat. It doesn't get much attention in the dominant media, but this is a real threat. And the Trudeau government, it's kind of interesting to see the Trudeau government's policy on nuclear weapons, because officially they say that nuclear weapons are terrible. We got to work to get rid of nuclear weapons. And according to the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Rob Oliphant, said, quote, "We are committed," this is about a year ago, "we are committed to achieving a world free of nuclear weapons." That's a pretty clear statement from Canadian officials, a very good statement. But in practice, they oppose efforts to rid the world of nuclear weapons or to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. Concretely, they opposed the holding the 2017 UN conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. The UN is good at very snappy names, snappy titles. That meeting established the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which 2/3 of UN member states participated in the negotiating meeting. And then subsequently, about 130 countries voted in favor of that. The Canadian government has voted against all of those measures. So on one hand, we say, the Trudeau government, so on one hand, they say we want to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. On the other hand, they vote against, they boycott efforts to criminalize nuclear weapons. And that's what the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons does. And it came into force about a year ago. And the countries that have signed it, which is more than 50, the nuclear weapons are illegal there. It also has another component of pressuring companies and different institutions that are complicit in nuclear weapons production to also target them and using the treaty to put pressure. So it's a very good development, but the Canadian government has been hostile to it. This isn't new in Canadian policy. In the book Just Dummies: Cruise Missile Testing in Canada, John Clearwater writes, quote, this book came out I believe in 2006. The record clearly shows that Canada refuses to support any resolution that specifies immediate action on a comprehensive approach to ridding the world of nuclear weapons, right? Right now, we hear a lot about nuclear. The one issue we hear about nuclear weapons is Iran. We're all concerned about Iran potentially getting nuclear weapons. It is not a good thing for Iran to get, it would not be a good thing for Iran to get nuclear weapons. We want fewer countries. But the countries that are all whipped up about Iran getting nuclear weapons, the US, Western European countries, Israel, as well as China, Russia, well, they have nuclear weapons, right? Israel opposes a Middle East nuclear weapons free zone, right? Which exists in some other regions, which would be, if you really want to ensure that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons, have a nuclear weapons free zone, have serious investigation, serious measures to uphold that. The Canadian government has been opposed to those efforts to have a nuclear weapons free zone, which is supported in most countries in that region. A bit over a year ago, Canada joined the US, Israel, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau in voting against a resolution calling on Israel to sign the treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, the NPT treaty. 153 countries backed that resolution. So Canada's diplomatic policy has not been to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons historically or today, even though Canadian officials often claim that's what they're trying to do. And after the 9 countries in the world that have nuclear weapons, Canada would be right there, right after that, in terms of country that's contributed to nuclear arms race proliferation. Going back to the bombs that were dropped by the Americans on Japan, you had Canadian uranium that was part of that. You had the agreements between the American and British government around nuclear science and testing. So there was the Quebec Agreement of 1943, where the US and nuclear weapons programs were basically brought together. And the UK nuclear weapons program was actually moved to Canada during World War II. You had the prominent Canadian minister, C.D. Howe, was part of the World War II Combined Policy Committee, where the Americans brought their plan to drop the nuclear weapons on Japan to it. We don't know exactly what C.D. Howe said at the meeting, but presumably he was supportive. After the Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed, C.D. Howe said, quote, this, and he said this publicly, not privately. He said, quote, "It gives me pleasure to announce that Canadian scientists played an important role, having been intimately connected in an efficient manner to this great scientific development." Right? So openly supportive of nuclear weapons being dropped on Japan and having played a role in that process. And you see that continue on, more recently when India detonated a nuclear weapon. It was with the Canadian, the Cyrus Canadian reactor. The book, The Politics of Can-Do Exports, Can-Do being the Canadian nuclear agency, it says, quote, "The Indians chose to use Cyrus for their supply of plutonium and not one of their other reactors, because Cyrus was not governed by any nuclear safeguards." So the Canadian government knew that India was going in that direction and didn't care that much. In the 1960s, late 1960s, Canada had about 250 to 450 atomic bombs at its disposal, right? You had Honest John surface-to-surface missiles. You had Canadian fighter jets in Germany that didn't even have a gun. They just had MK-28 nuclear bombs. The first nuclear weapons came to Canada are thought to have come to Canada in 1950, American nuclear weapons. In 1963, actually a government fell, and it was a very big political issue, bringing the Bomark missiles, US Bomark missiles to Canada, which were nuclear tipped. And so there was a point for more than a decade where there were US nuclear weapons stationed in Canada, Bomark missiles, North Bay and La Macasa here in Quebec, where the US officials in Colorado, NORAD officials, basically had the ability to launch those nuclear weapons without any Canadian any Canadian political okay, because that's the structure of NORAD, which is it was the most important of Canada's bilateral military accords with the US. And there are a lot of these bilateral military accords with the US. According to the Department of National Defense, there are, quote, 80 treaty level agreements, more than 250 memoranda of understanding, and 145 bilateral forums on defense between the US and Canadian militaries. So again, NORAD is the most important one. The commander-in-chief is a general in the US Air Force, and the deputy commander is a Canadian Air Force general. It's based in Colorado Springs. There's regional headquarters in Alaska, Florida, Winnipeg. The idea of NORAD is, to protect North America's airspace. Historically, the idea was, Russian fighter jets, bombers coming over from the north and coming to bomb the U.S. and therefore Canada and the U.S. needed to detect those as early on as possible and prepare to defend North America. This can't be taken seriously. I mean, you can't talk about a defensive arrangement with a military that has 800 bases around the world. It has its troops stationed in something like 145 countries in the world. It's a empire of unique proportions in the history of humanity, and even Canada. You compare Canada to the new boogeyman that's being put forward to us, China. Well, Canada actually has more international bases than China has, right? China only has one foreign base. Canada has a base in Jamaica, base in Kuwait, Senegal, and is negotiating for a couple of other bases. So this is not about defense, right? This is about domination. This is about corporate profits. I'll get to a little bit of that. And this is about supporting belligerents, most importantly, supporting U.S. Global belligerents. And so from the standpoint of the military companies, right? NATO or NORAD is used to justify upgrading radar, satellite, jets, vessels, right? With the ongoing plan to purchase 88 new fighter jets. The Americans need to provide a okay on what's chosen by the Canadian Air Force, so it's interoperable with NORAD. Well, that makes it almost certain that Canada is going to purchase the F-35 versus the Swedish fighter jet, the Saab's Gripen fighter jet. So from the standpoint of American, again, similar to NATO, standpoint of the American military industrial complex, NORAD has a benefit. But the most important part is Canadian complicity in U.S. imperialism. And we don't hear a lot about it, but this goes back, right from the establishment of NORAD, which was signed in 1957 and officially launched in 1958. So right away, when the U.S. invaded Lebanon in 1958, NORAD went on increased readiness. Similarly, during the illegal blockade of Cuba in 1962, American blockade of Cuba put on high alert. Likewise, during the 1973 Ramadan or Yom Kippur Arab-Israeli war, Canadian equipment and personnel at NORAD went on high alert. More recently, NORAD supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, the one that we ostensibly were not part of. NORAD provides support for U.S. bombings in Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, right? So much of air wars, so much of war is ground, logistical support from the ground, and NATO or NORAD is part of that. Supporting that process around the world. And I've joked that if the U.S. was to invade Canada, they would be Canadian officials at NORAD headquarters that would be, supporting the U.S. invasion of Canada. So this is not about defending North America from the Russian boogeyman or now the Chinese. This is about a arrangement that does have an element that's protective, but overwhelmingly it's about bringing the Canadian military into integration with the U.S. military and is about supporting U.S.-led dominance in the region or of the world. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about these questions, Canadian military's sort of subservience to the U.S. military, they kind of frame it as it's just sort of Canada being, a lapdog of the U.S. and we got to, fight for our independence and this kind of stuff. And there's elements of truth to that kind of framing, but I think it misses the point. And it misses the point in a number of different levels. Basically, the Canadian military gets a very good deal from NORAD, right? They get access to way more sophisticated weaponry. It's a Canadian who's second in charge if the American general is not there. They there's a arms industry element to it as well, right? So alongside the establishment of NORAD was the Defense Production Sharing Arrangement. And basically what the Defense Production Sharing Arrangement did, which was signed in 1956, it made Canadian military firms, arms manufacturers, part of the North American industrial base, arms manufacturing base. So basically they could sell to the Pentagon, Canadian firms could sell to the Pentagon, and they're basically treated as if they're American companies. Well, the Pentagon's the biggest purchaser of weapons in the world, so that of course is very good for Canadian arms companies. And the Americans agreed to that in large part to have a force, politically speaking here, of corporations that were tied to American militarism and that saw their interests in U.S. militarism. So NORAD, the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, are part of this broader policy that is about Canada being part of American militarism at a corporate level, political level. And also when we look at the Canadian military itself and how it's structured in its mindset, like I started off with, it was a fluid transition from being tied into British imperial domination of the world to being tied into American military domination of the world. That's the Canadian military's history. And there's never really a clear break from supporting imperialism. And there's studies that show this. There's one done in 2000 of Canadian naval officers. They were naval officers of 5 different countries that its roots were with the British military. So South Africa, Argentina, India, Canada, and Australia. And the Canadians and Australians viewed themselves as part of this maritime force that was all around the world, that it was a global force. The Indians, South Africans, and Argentinians viewed themselves as sort of like major players in their region. So the Canadians and Australians are, basically viewed themselves as part of the American Empire, right? They went from the British to the American Empire, and this sort of kind of world domination and world influence. So that's the context that I think we need to understand NORAD and NATO within, is that the Canadian military, probably more than any other major institution, has been part of the 2 main empires of the past couple hundred years, and has done well by that. That's been good for them, and more than other that I think that's generalized within Canadian society. But I would say more than any other institutions, right? Like Canadian capitalists, the business class, yes, they clearly have done well by tying themselves to historically the British and today the Americans. But you see some tensions on that front, right? I think with regards to China today, there's some tensions where there's a lot of the business class wants to invest in China and sees a lot, big market, and sees making a lot of money from a combination of trade and investment in China, and are quite uncomfortable by ratcheting up tensions with China. On the other hand, the military and the security forces within intelligence forces within Canada are completely supportive of ramping up tensions with China, because they're so integrated with the U.S. They see their budgets, going up, justified in part on the new Chinese boogeyman. So this, I think, is the way to understand NATO, NORAD, and Canadian militarism as being intimately tied with the historically the British, today the American militaries, and that this has been something that's proved beneficial to them. And it's our job, for those who are concerned with questions of peace, who are concerned with questions of the climate crisis, and quite frankly, the survival of the species and civilization. We need to demilitarize, and we need to do it. We need to do it in a pretty radical form. It's not; these questions aren't really on the agenda. Canada out of NORAD, Canada out of NATO aren't really on the political official political agenda. There's no political party that's really, or that has a position in the House of Commons, at least, that's really raising these questions. But these are the questions that we need to raise. There's lots of room, on nuclear weapons is one where there's a lot of room, a lot of support. Public opinion is very much supportive of efforts to ban nuclear weapons and things like the UN Nuclear Ban Treaty. We can really embarrass the Trudeau government on its claims to support denuclearization, its claims to support the international rules-based order and a feminist foreign policy. All of those things are served, of course, by Canada signing a UN nuclear ban treaty. We can raising those issues puts the Trudeau government in quite an embarrassing position. NORAD and NATO, I don't think the public opinion is quite as clear cut. But there is a lot of support there. Historically, the NDP, after large battles internally, the NDP came around to Canada out of NORAD, and then a little bit later, Canada out of NATO positions. And that was, I think, the vast majority of members support that. But that was, gotten rid of by the leadership when they were trying. They thought they had a chance of winning elections in the late 1980s. But there's sympathy for, I think there's significant sympathy for public resources to be put into other areas. That polling is quite clear. Polling shows that the Canadian military is people generally are sympathetic to the institution, but they consistently put military spending at the bottom of the list of what they want or their political priority. They want money going to education, healthcare, daycare. They consider, the economy, climate as their political priorities. Consistently, the military is at the bottom, either with regards to political priority or public spending. So there's places that even right now, even in a climate where the arms firms and the military have all their different institutions pumping out all their propaganda, their different think tanks and the university departments and this huge public relations apparatus, there's still quite a bit of popular support for going in a different direction. And it's our job, and I think this is what World Beyond War is all about, and obviously the Montreal chapter as well, is about building that support and turning it into a political movement that can shape policy. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yves. That was amazing. That was very, very, very interesting. Couldn't help putting all kinds of comments in the chat, but it's mostly garble. However, there are some questions, and Rachel has been, I think, monitoring the questions that appeared in the chat. So should we get started right away with the chat, or should I recap how chat works? Just so you know, you raise your hand through the reactions button. So you can raise your hand, and then Rachel, who's much more well-versed in this than I, will check and call on you. So I'll just mute myself, and thank you so much, Yves. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I want to echo that thank you. There was a lot of information in a short period of time, but it's I was going to say such a good story. It's not a great story. It's a terrible story, but such a well put together story of these very complex institutions over so much time, and complex in many ways because what they're actually doing has been so hidden from so many of us and is not the story that we usually hear. So thank you for that. So I'll alternate between taking people's raised hands, and then they can unmute and ask the question directly, and taking questions from the chat. And yeah, and a reminder, like, nous vous invitons à nous poser toute question ou en anglais ou en français ou en l'écrivant dans le chat ou en soulevant votre main. So again, in English or in French is fine, in the chat or raising your hand. We want to have an inclusive discussion and we really want to hear from all of you. So I'll start by asking Corinne to unmute and ask the question that they have out loud. Go ahead, Corinne.
Yes, I was wondering if you could elaborate about the position change of NATO, the NDP on NATO and NORAD a little further, because I was unaware of this. And when you're trying to work on the ground with peace organizations, these are your potential allies. So I really need to, I was unaware that there had been a significant change here. So I just would like a little more information.
Yeah, the CCF, the predecessor of the NDP, supported the creation of NATO. And that was the position of the party through the 1950s and into the 1960s. And in my book, Left, Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada, I go through some of the history. And basically, NATO and NORAD became, particularly NATO, became sort of the number one controversy at CCF, then NDP conventions, debate over these issues. I believe it's in 1969 that the anti-NATO forces finally won the vote. And the leadership of the party did all kinds of things over like literally expelling people and stuff for taking anti-NATO positions. They did all kinds of things to try to block the momentum, but finally, after basically 2 decades, the anti-NATO forces won, and they got the resolution that became official policy. I don't know the exact wording of the policy, but it was basically Canada out of NATO, and that position remained on the books. I actually think officially it even still sort of remains on the books, but basically by Broadbent in I think it's 87, when he's in I think coming, I don't know if it's the 87 election, 86 election, but he's basically in the lead. And then he just basically by fiat pushes the anti-NATO position aside. I don't know the internal mechanisms of how that happened. And I believe I've been told since I've written about this, people told me about things that happened within the Ontario NDP of people being expelled, and then a big controversy over the Ontario NDP and this position. So it's been a live debate. More recently, Mulcair, I know, was very clear. We're proud members of NATO. In the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute election survey for this most recent election, we asked the question about should parties, or we sent it to all the parties, but the NDP's answer about should Canada stay, I think it was how to frame it, the same, more, less, and then listed different foreign policy alliances, including NATO. And the NDP's response was it should be the same. So we should continue the same amount of our involvement in NATO. So now they're officially supportive of NATO. But I also believe, I can't remember the specifics now, but in the April NDP convention, there was a resolution that was put forward, never got debated, that I believe had something to the effect of Canada out of NATO. That I believe the National Post picked up on that in the lead up to the convention to criticize the party. It's live, right? There is significant amount of the membership that are supportive of Canada out of NATO. That this is an issue that is live at the base level of the party, right? I think if you go and talk to NDP activists, many of them probably do support continuing part of NATO, but they don't at all consider that an objectionable opinion to say Canada out of NATO. Just recently, I noticed that the candidate for the president of the left party in France, France Insoumise, Luc Mélenchon, I believe is pronounced his name. He reiterated that he believes France should pull out of NATO. Right? There's a number of the Social Democrats in power in Sweden. They don't support NATO. So I was thinking of writing an article that kind of talked about the different left forces in Europe. That again, if it's supposed to be this defensive arrangement, the European country. Sweden is much closer to Russia than Canada is, right? So if these left forces within Europe can be saying, pull out of NATO, or then certainly we should expect the NDP, and I would even go further, that Canadian democracy is almost sort of like necessitates having a major political party, or a significant political party, putting forward that demand, because clearly there's a significant chunk of Canadians that are supportive of that position. It's a totally reasonable position, and there should be a political voice if we're going to have a pluralistic kind of political system that has a voice calling for the most important military institution we're part of, and arguably the most important foreign policy institution that Canada's part of. So I think even kind of on the realm of like, well, what's the point of a left opposition party if you can't put forward this type of Canada NATO position, right? So I think that the debate within the NDP is something that was a really big part of the whole movement against NATO historically, and I think would probably have to be going forward as well.
Thanks. We just got a really interesting question in the chat that I'm going to read out from Samira. The question is, can you talk about connecting the struggle against Canada's external imperial militarism with the struggles against Canada's internal colonial militarism against Indigenous people, so that we don't have an opposition to Canadian complicity in American empire that's premised on an exaltation of Canadian independence, aka colonial sovereignty?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first point is to be totally clear what the Canadian military's roots are. The Canadian military's roots are the forces that were, putting bounties on the heads of Mi'kmaq in what's current day Eastern Canada. It was the force that had gunboat diplomacy up and down, up to Haida Gwaii and up and down the British Columbia coast, intimidating, firing cannons into Indigenous communities that didn't follow what they wanted them to follow in the mid late 1800s. That's the history. Obviously, the different suppression of the Riel rebellions and whatnot in the prairies. So that's the history of the Canadian military. Very clearly, the history of the Canadian military, and that history has what happened with the Mohawk here, sending the troops there. There's a little bit of military involvement. It looks like some people suggest JTF-2 was in Gustafson Lake in 1995, suppressing land defenders and Indigenous activists. Military intelligence, spying on Idle No More more recently. So there, in 2006, 2007, they had the Canadian military had a counterinsurgency manual that mentioned the Mohawk resistance as a basically threat to the Canadian state. The draft manual came out, and there was a pushback, a political pushback, and then they kind of apologized and removed it. But the Canadian military, I mean, it's politically sensitive for them, but they have viewed, obviously, or continue to view, and certainly historically, it's absolutely crystal clear, continue to view Indigenous land back movements as a threat to the Canadian state and the power of the Canadian state. So I think that needs to be put forward and made clear. I also think that I think there is there's definitely room for tactical Canadian military shouldn't just be a tool of U.S. imperialism, right? There, like I think we concretely, the Canadian military, the pressure point at which the Canadian military gets dispatched to bomb Libya, the most direct pressure point is the American military and the American military pushing that type of policy, which is obviously a terrible policy. So I think that there's definitely, to say that we want the Canadian military to be independent of the U.S. military is a totally reasonable political position. We of course shouldn't be involved in sort of mythologizing the history of the Canadian military when doing that, and particularly with regards to the colonization of Canada.
Thanks. I'm not seeing any hands, although maybe I'll take a quick look if anyone.
I have a question.
Sure. Yeah. Just one sec. I'm just going to look if anyone who wants to actually on their video camera raise their hand if they don't want to push the Zoom button, but I'm not seeing any right now. Go ahead, Kim.
I just wonder if we could make a case for the parallel between the mindset of the NRA, which says, everybody needs a gun in order to protect themselves, which was kind of light shone on that by Michael Moore's movie Bowling for Columbine, when he showed the murder rate in the United States as people are living in a state of fear and they're killing each other inadvertently and on purpose sometimes too, with all this gun culture. And why would we want to participate if we think of ourselves as separate from that and immune to that? Then why would we participate by proxy in American style defense, which is nothing more than arming ourselves militarily instead of arming ourselves with handguns? But we're still arming ourselves and using the excuse that it's, yes, somebody put dollar signs, you're right, but using the excuse that it's in the interest of defense. And somebody else pointed out that if they really wanted defense with this 19 or $18 billion contract to buy F-35s, if they really wanted to defend the sky, that isn't even the plane that they would use for defense. They would use something like an interceptor. So it's all, pardon me, French, pardon me for saying so, but it's all bullshit. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the left or major sectors of progressives have long argued that security is better found in making sure that every kid gets a proper meal when they go to school, making sure that ecological damage doesn't happen or is properly cleaned up, and that public resources should go to the better preventative medicine and different public health measures, that's going to do a lot more for the security of most Canadians, or for that matter, most Americans, than putting a bunch of money, public resources into fighter jets or more military spending. That's been an argument that I think has been put forward for a long time. I think it's been a sound argument for a long time. With the context of the climate crisis and the pandemic, to me, the sort of security arguments that the militarists are putting forward are completely untenable. Absolutely, completely untenable, right? For 2 years now, we've been in a lockdown because of a virus, or people's lives have been heavily disrupted, and more than 30,000 Canadians have died because of a virus that the military can't do. Fighter jets can't do anything. The naval vessels, we're going to spend $350 billion over the life cycle, $100 billion up front, $350 billion over the life cycle for the new fighter jets and naval vessels. That's the plan. But they can't do anything about a virus. They can't do anything about, they actually worsen the climate crisis, right? And they can't do anything, even some military equipment can provide some utility around, natural disasters or whatever, but fighter jets can't do anything in terms of, like water bombers or other things to deal with what happened in Lytton, BC, and the destruction of that town after 3 days in a row of the highest record, highest heat record in Canadian history. So to me, the security argument for the pumping huge amounts of money the current level of money in the military machine, let alone the expansion that's being planned, is just absolutely untenable. And I think that like the vast majority of people, when they get put that in front of them, they'll agree with that. They'll agree that I think there is I think there is some interesting elements with regards to the pandemic, in terms of, I think it's increased people's fear. And I think that the militarists actually do generally play well off of fear. So there's some interesting dynamics in public opinion. I think I haven't seen studies that really delved into this, but I would guess that this is the case. But I think that the climate crisis and the pandemic, if you put forward to them how useless the military, and not just the military, but the whole intelligence security apparatus that we put all this money into. And that's actually in part why the military pushes their involvement in helping out with the pandemic. There was this one story, there was like 5 nurses from the Canadian military that were sent about a year ago I think it was in Ontario, to help out with some pandemic related stuff, health support, and it got front page of the Globe Mail, right? And that's the Canadian military with a huge public relations apparatus pushing this idea the military will help us out. It's been, totally, almost entirely useless, the military, in the context of the pandemic. There's some utility in some situations of natural disasters that the military does have, because we put so much resources into it. It's a big institution. It can have some utility in some moments, but they're way better mechanisms to organize that institutionally. So to me, that the whole security argument, the climate crisis and the pandemic really undercut the militarists' security argument.
Thank you. I see there's a good number of questions. I was actually going to read one that Claire had written in the chat, so I'll read it. And then Claire, if you want to add anything out loud, I'll invite you to do so. So Claire's question had to do with basically if there's any ways that maybe NATO could be used in a better way. So the question is, could NATO take on a more peaceful role? Example, humanitarian aid, education, health, to create peace without arms or force. So is there something that this could be used for as an alternative? Claire, did you want to add anything out loud? No? Okay, great. Go ahead, Yves.
I mean, you like at some like theoretical level that right, like, but that's not the practical utility of NATO. I mean, there's this whole thing that back in the establishing NATO, and Lester Pearson pushed for the political component to NATO. That's just propaganda, kind of like claiming this sort of, it's about democracy. I mean, there was all kinds of dictatorships, open dictatorships that were part of NATO for many, many years. They were, these were the European colonial powers at the time. So, I think that, I think there is just even more generally, I think there's real questions about military alliances like that, right? As they for those who are outside of those alliances, they often feel like being ganged up on. Right. So whether that even at a kind of a bit more of an abstract level, that sort of those international military alliances are a good thing. I think that we do way better to reinforce the UN. There's significant problems with the UN structure, but we'd be way better to reinforce the UN and the thing that the Trudeau government loves going on about, the international rules-based order. I think the international rules-based order is a very good idea, and we should be doing a lot more to uphold the international rules-based order. That's the direction. Get rid of the NATO, get rid of the NORAD, move towards the international rules-based order. And that, there's a concrete example: the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That's security. That's a different a form of security than the militarist options. Let's all get ourselves nuclear weapons and prepared for mutually assured destruction. And then there's, I think, the vast majority of humanity's perspective, which is like, let's try to have some international negotiations that can de-escalate these horrific weapons. And I think that general idea goes with NATO. NATO is a force of destabilization, of maintaining global inequities, and we need to first of all, push the idea of Canada out of NATO. I think more generally, NATO should be dismantled, and there's alternative forms of bringing that security that that NATO sometimes claims they're trying to bring.
Great, thanks. Allison, I saw that you had your hand up. Did you still want to ask a question or not at this point? Okay, so
I'm trying to unmute.
yep, you've unmuted. We hear you.
Okay. Well, first, thank you, Yves, for this very interesting talk. And could you say a bit more about the international rules for peace and order, or whatever you called it?
Well, the biggest marketing strategy of the Trudeau government's foreign policy after Chrystia Freeland became foreign minister in 2017, Stéphane Dion had a different, what was his, I forget his slogan right now, but was the international rules-based order, that we're supporting the international rules-based order. All of Canadian foreign policy is about the international rules-based order. You see that Joe Biden uses similar type language, and Joe Biden administration uses similar type of language today. Of course, that was not Donald Trump's kind of, so it was the international rules-based order was a little bit of Canada positioning a little bit off of Trump's kind of what would be perceived as unilateralism. And, but what is the international rules-based order? I mean, I've documented in my book on Trudeau about all the different ways in which Canada violates the international rules-based order, right? So all kinds of sanctions, right? The UN says sanctions, if there's going to be sanctions, it has to be through the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Charter, the Organization of American States Charter says, non-interference in other countries' affairs is a clear violation of the UN Charter. Well, Canada literally decided that Canada, US decided that some opposition politician in Venezuela was the legitimate president of the country. I mean, it's an extreme example of interfering in the internal affairs of another country. As I mentioned previously, signing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That's the international rules-based order that we want to expand, right? And there are many other forms of that, and the Trudeau government doesn't support that because there are powerful interests that are against that. There's the treaty on cluster munitions, landmine treaty. Those are things that are expanding the international rules-based order. I think that the UN Charter is for all kinds of problems, very significant problems within the UN. The UN heavily replicates the power imbalances of the world, right? And I've somebody who's done a lot of stuff on Canada's role in Haiti, and you'll find that the UN was incredibly devastating, played a very devastating role in Haiti at the behest of Washington, Ottawa, and Paris. So the UN is not, and peacekeeping is not far from a something to just ipso facto support. But generally, it's better than the NATO alternative, and there's many initiatives that are there's no reason why we can't. There's been efforts previously to empower UN bodies around economic issues, right? Instead of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which are structured among the rich countries, North American, European countries dominating, put more of that power in the UN, the economic power, and expand that to deal with global inequities. So there's been efforts on these issues, going back decades and decades, and some of them still exist. Canada has consistently been offside with those efforts because, again, this gets back to the initial question, Canada, the Canadian military most clearly, but the Canadian elite more generally and corporate world have been part of the two main empires, the British and American over the past 2 centuries. And they have viewed the world from that perspective. They've profited from that. In the case of the Canadian military, it's absolutely unequivocal. That's their worldview, and that's been beneficial to them. So I think that we as people who are internationalist, justice-minded, need to be honest about that, and need to challenge that, and that's part of what this World Beyond War Montreal is about. I think is challenging one part of that, particularly the militarist element of it. There's other elements to it. And pushing a real international rules-based order. Yes, let's. I agree with their rhetoric. Their policy, the Trudeau government's policy hasn't, or the Joe Biden administration's policy is far from actually upholding that international rules-based order. But the rhetoric is on the right track.
Absolutely. Who actually chooses what the rules are? Is it actually an international, or is it actually just, yes, who are they imagining when they say that for real? Greg, go ahead, please ask your question.
Thank you, Rachel. Yves, I was just wondering, first of all, thank you for your wonderful columns, which are so informative, as well as your books. I read them regularly, and they just are eye-opening. As you suggested, I think the majority of Canadians are very much with, signing the UN International Treaty on Banning Nuclear Weapons. They are for, genuine diplomatic ways of resolving international conflict. How would you suggest that we mobilize the peace movement and galvanize the left towards bringing this forward? In the last federal election, in both debates, foreign policy wasn't discussed at all, really, in any in-depth way. And the debate seemed structured, in fact, so that couldn't even occur. So how do we bring this forward effectively? I've called my MP, and I get nowhere on many of these issues.
You know what? I'm going to tack another question from the chat that's very similar onto that, because we're almost out of time. And I think it goes together with Greg's question very well. There was a question earlier from Ken that's also about sort of this strategy question, where he asked whether you think that any new pan-Canadian peace network, or conceivably any network that's bringing together lots of different groups, should be right now calling for Canada to withdraw from NATO and NORAD, to join the non-aligned movement, and to call for all Canadian troops, planes, ships, etc., in Eastern Europe to be repatriated back to Canada. So another question about strategy and what you think we should be calling for.
Yeah, I think the most from a peace movement or anti-war movement, demilitarization movement, I think the campaign that's most dynamic is the No Fighter Jet Coalition, and that's, I think, there's been a certain amount. It's still unfortunately we're off the formal political agenda, where the NDP is not really taking up the call. The Greens a little bit. But that's one that sort of galvanized a certain amount of popular support. And there's, obviously, many groups across the country that have done campaigning on that. So I think that's very concretely a campaign that we need to keep pushing, and it opens up. We want the win, right? We want the win in that they buy no fighter jets. We want the win and they go from 88 down to 65 or to 60, or we want the win, right? We want the wins. And I think that those are going to be, those are tough wins to get. We want something on that. It also has an educational element of like, what have Canadian fighter jets been used for, which is aggressive NATO wars. So there's a popular education component to that. So that concretely. Now the what do you do to get these issues onto the agenda? I mean, it's organizing, right? And there's no sort of special method to organize this work. Doing it as intelligently as we can, which means many different things in many different moments. I think it's also, we need to be clear that if we're gonna win these things, email petitions are really good. Email campaigns are really good, but there's gonna have to be offices occupied. There's gonna have to be politicians disrupted. Obviously, the whole pandemic has undercut a lot of that stuff. Before the pandemic got going, I was involved with Disruption Network Canada, and then basically what we did was we disrupted primarily Liberal ministers, but politicians more generally, their press conferences and their election in the 2019 election. So things like that, I think, need to happen. So there's just many facets to that, getting these issues on the agenda. If the corporate media and the dominant media are going to refuse to bring these issues up, and that's more or less, some of them they're willing to talk about a little bit, but more or less on the foreign policy issues, either they completely adopt the Washington, Ottawa perspective, or they just don't talk about the issues. Then we have to figure out ways of getting around that and forcing the issues into dominant media. And one of the ways is by disrupting politicians' press conferences. Another way, I mean, this is on Haiti activism that I've done. Is kind of interesting element is that so on Canada's role in Haiti, the main people who go down to main foreign correspondents, increasingly they don't even exist, but I'm talking about 15 years ago with the 2004 coup that Canada was part of. The main sort of journalists dealing with the issue, they totally adopted Ottawa's perspective. The way that we were able to break into the media and cause a bit of discomfort for the government was entirely through local angle. So you get the local CTV camera person or news desk. They don't really care about Canada, Haiti. What they care about is, okay, there's some local thing happening. And so in the case of Montreal, where there's a major Haitian community, there's an added angle of like Haitian community is protesting Canadian government officials. So those kind of dynamics are important to keep in mind when thinking about what to do. But the main question is really just getting organized. And that's the importance of, World Beyond War Canada, World Beyond War Montreal, the No Fighter Jet Coalition, and different groups. The problem that we have is that the military has hundreds and hundreds of full-time public relations officials. The Canadian Global Affairs Institute has funding from Lockheed Martin, funding from General Dynamics, funding from the Canadian military. There's the other mining, the most important global affairs program at Canadian University, the Monk School of Global Affairs, was set up by a very wealthy right-wing mining head of Barrick Gold mining executive who had a clear outlook on the world. When you look at the political economy of challenging Canadian foreign policy, it's really pretty stark. I mean, I detailed it in my book, A Propaganda System, So what we have is people power. What we have is motivated volunteer activism. What we have is, I think, truth, often, most of the time. But how do you pierce that through the structural imbalance? Is difficult. I mean, it's a lot of work, and to the extent we try to do it as intelligently as possible, but it's about pushing.
Thank you so much. This is the best problem to have. We have lots more questions and no more time to answer it because it was such a fulsome discussion. There's about 1 million things I could promote or ways that people could take further action. But one thing I do want to share, because it seems like there's still so much desire to continue this particular conversation with Yves, is that World Beyond War is really thrilled, and I know Kim mentioned this a bit at the beginning, to be hosting a book club with Yves around his new book, Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. We launched this new type of book club last year, and it's been really successful and really interesting. So these are really small groups. These are not webinars. It's a maximum of 18 people, including the author, who read the book together over 4 weeks and discuss it together. So this is like an in-depth chance to really jump into these issues. We've just opened the registration for these book clubs. There's only 16 spots left. So if anyone is interested, I would encourage you to register. I'll put the link in the chat, and we'll also send it out in follow up to this. But for those whose questions didn't get answered, obviously there will be other chances. But if you really want to talk more about this in depth, that's one way that I would definitely encourage. And for those who don't want to join the book club, I would still encourage you to buy from an independent bookstore Yves' book. It's excellent, and yeah, has the information that you need to continue working in the movements that we're talking about and the struggles that we're talking about to continue to push this forward. It's definitely a David and Goliath struggle of us versus the biggest institutions in the country, but I think there's a role for all of us in it. I'm going to pass it back up to Kim to wrap up the event for us.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you so much, Yves. That's so inspiring. It's just so inspiring to see all your smiling faces and to know that we're here doing this, and hope that we've created some kind of good karma and that we'll all go forth and use some of these ideas productively in our lives. I have a quote from JFK that I liked, that I thought I would read. He said, peace is a daily, a weekly, a monthly process, gradually changing opinions, slowly eroding old barriers, quietly building new structures. So I like that as a kind of a reminder for ourselves, because it can be very discouraging and you want results, and it's just an ongoing process for just an ongoing process that we cannot turn away from. I hope that doesn't sound too dreary. Lâche pas is what I'm trying to say. I wanted to mention that the No Fighter Jets campaign, we have new flyers here in Montreal. I can give anybody that wants to deliver flyers in French and in English for the No Fighter Jets campaign, which is all about the kind of the offshoot of NATO and our alliances with the American superpower. So if you want to try to stop that, they're going to decide in, I think it's March this year, the government is going to finally make a final decision. And I think there's still time we can stop these fighter jets from being purchased and make them a really controversial and topical, timely subject. So if you want to hand out flyers in the metro, ideally here in Montreal, just get in touch with me. There will be a follow-up email, so you'll have my contact information there if you don't have it already. And I'd be happy. I already went and gave some out at Villa Maria yesterday, and I'm going to print up as many as we need to hand out. Thousands and thousands. If you're willing to hand them out, I'm willing to print them up for you. The other thing I wanted to mention is I was interviewed by Rosemary Wally. Some of you local people probably know Rosemary because she's a very active activist. And she has a little radio show called Old Women's Lives, or Older Women's Lives, or Lively Old Ladies, LOL. I don't know. It's something like OWL. Anyway, I was interviewed on that, and it's going to be playing tonight at 6 p.m. I think in the second half of the show. It's about the fighter jets, the whole fighter jets campaign, and it's on CKUT. So if you go to ckut.ca at 6 p.m., you'll hear it. And okay, the brochures, the flyers, you guys, I already put the link to No Fighter Jets campaign. I think that's it. So I just want to thank you all so much for coming and for caring, and Yves for his sharing his activism and his broad knowledge. And I hope you'll attend the book club if you haven't read the book yet, because it's a great book. I guess that's it. Rachel, Yves, did you want to add anything?
No, just thanks to World Beyond War and World Beyond War Montreal for organizing this, and everyone for coming.
And if you want to join World Beyond War or any of our chapters, I encourage you to do so. Thank you. And subscribe to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute newsletter as well. There's so many things I could say. I'll stop now.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and we'll follow up by email. Bye.
Okay, everyone. Thanks.